On the morning of the 2nd of June 1944, a Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilot flew his Messed Bf-109 over Kent at 25,000 ft, snapping photographs of what appeared to be massive Allied tank formations assembling near Dover. He counted over 350 tanks, row upon row of Shermans and Churchills, clustered around fictitious headquarters installations, complete with wireless aerials and vehicle tracks carved into the mud. His intelligence officers would later use these photographs to confirm German High Command's worst fears. The main Allied invasion would strike at the Padakel, the shortest crossing from Dover to France, where this enormous armored force was clearly preparing to embark. There was only one problem. Not a single tank the pilot photographed was real. Everyone was constructed from timber framing, painted canvas, and inflatable rubber. Some weighed less than 60 lb. A team of 4 men could erect one in under 3 hours. They cost approximately £15 each to manufacture, roughly 1,000th the price of an actual Churchill tank. This wasn't desperation or make-do improvisation from a nation short on material. By June 1944, Britain's factories were producing tanks at unprecedented rates, with over 5,000 Shermans alone delivered under Lend-Lease arrangements. The wooden tank program represented something far more sophisticated, a calculated exploitation of the enemy's own reconnaissance capabilities, turning the Germans' aerial photography, their most reliable intelligence source, into a weapon against them. What appeared to be Britain's greatest vulnerability, the inability to hide massive troop concentrations from enemy observation, became the very mechanism through which they controlled what the enemy saw, believed, and ultimately where they positioned their divisions. This wasn't theater for theater's sake. It was operational deception raised to strategic art. Military theorists entering the Second World War held firm convictions about battlefield deception. The Great War had demonstrated that large-scale troop movements could be concealed through darkness, weather, and camouflage netting. The influential 1936 German manual Truppenführer emphasized Übersurprise achieved through speed, security, and operational concealment. Soviet Maskirovka doctrine, which German intelligence officers study closely, focused on hiding genuine strength whilst displaying false weakness. Standard military thinking emphasized making your actual forces invisible whilst presenting a facade of normality. The British took precisely the opposite approach. Rather than attempting to hide 150,000 men and thousands of vehicles through concealment alone, an impossible task given German aerial reconnaissance flew over Britain dozens of times weekly. They chose to hide them in plain sight by creating something so convincing the Germans would look no further. The key wasn't invisibility. It was plausibility. Where the Germans sought to prevent enemy observation, the British sought to control what that observation revealed. The secret was in understanding how intelligence analysis actually functioned. In 1944, German photo reconnaissance interpreters worked in a system drowning in information. A single sortie might produce 800 individual photographs requiring analysis. Interpreters looked for specific signatures, vehicle track patterns, the characteristic shape of tank silhouettes, the placement of support vehicles, wireless aerials indicating headquarters units. They didn't have time to question whether what they observed was genuine. They needed to catalog it, compare it to previous imagery, and produce reports for operational planning. The British dummy tank program exploited this industrial approach to intelligence by creating decoys that perfectly matched every observable signature the Germans trained their interpreters to identify. They ensured those interpreters would see exactly what they expected to see and report it as confirmed. This wasn't accidental. Colonel John Turner, commanding the Camouflage Development and Training Center at Farnham, understood that modern deception wasn't about fooling the human eye at 50 yards. It was about fooling a camera lens at 5 m altitude. His unit conducted exhaustive tests, photographing dummy installations from various heights and angles, comparing the results to imagery of genuine units. Every detail that appeared in photographs of real formations had to appear identically in the decoys. Where it didn't matter, internal structure, weight, durability, they could improvise. Where it did visual outline, shadow pattern, arrangement relative to supporting elements, they achieved near-perfect fidelity. A genuine Churchill M7 infantry tank weighed 40 tons, required 5 crew members, cost £11,000 to manufacture, and took 8,000 man-h hours to complete. Its design incorporated 9 in thick frontal armor, a 75 gun, and complex mechanical systems, including a Merritt Brown gearbox and Bedford Twin 6 engine. Moving one required transporters, specialized rail cars, and careful route planning to accommodate its 24T in length and 108 in width. A Type B Mark V dummy Churchill, the standard pattern by 1944, consisted of a tubular steel or timber frame covered in painted Hessian canvas. The entire structure weighed between 60 and 100 lb, depending on configuration. 4 men could assemble one in 2 hours and 40 minutes. 2 men could lift it. A single 3-ton lorry could transport 30 collapsed dummy tanks, compared to requiring a 30-ton tank transporter for a single genuine Churchill. The material cost £10 to £18 per unit, depending on whether high-quality canvas or cheaper alternatives were employed. Critics argued this approach sacrificed realism for economy. They were correct about the materials, but catastrophically wrong about the result. What made dummy tanks work wasn't mimicking every aspect of the real thing. It was mimicking the specific aspects that mattered to aerial reconnaissance. German photo interpretation focused on 5 key signatures: overall silhouette shape, turret configuration, track marks in surrounding terrain, accompanying support vehicles, and dispersal patterns consistent with tactical deployment. The dummies needed to satisfy only these criteria. The reality of aerial photography showed what truly mattered. At 20,000 ft, the standard altitude for reconnaissance photography to avoid anti-aircraft fire, a Leica Fernov Clarings camera using 50 cm focal length lenses produced images where 1 m on the negative represented approximately 1 m on the ground. At this resolution, the three-dimensional solidity of armor plate versus canvas was invisible. What registered was outline, shadow, and spatial relationship to other objects. The dummy's lightweight canvas construction, which seemed like an obvious weakness, actually solved a critical problem. Genuine tanks created characteristic deep track patterns and crushed vegetation that took days to develop naturally. The light dummies allowed crews to procreate these track patterns using specialized rollers and rakes, controlling exactly what the Germans would photograph rather than hopping natural activity would look convincing. The strategic employment of dummy tanks reached its apex in Operation Fortitude South. The deception campaign, designed to convince German high command that the primary Allied invasion would strike the Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. Between March and June 1944, deception units deployed dummy installations, representing the fictitious 1st U.S. Army Group fusedly commanded by General George Patton, and comprising 11 divisions poised to cross from southeastern England. On paper, creating a phantom army group of 150,000 soldiers and 1,500 tanks through purely physical means shouldn't have worked. The Germans possessed extensive intelligence networks, conducted regular aerial reconnaissance, and employed sophisticated photo interpretation techniques. Fuseg installations had to withstand sustained observation, appear in multiple reconnaissance photographs taken weeks apart, and align with wireless traffic, double agent reports, and logical military planning. A single inconsistency: dummy tanks appearing overnight without the supporting infrastructure that would take weeks to establish, or installations lacking the inevitable changes that real encampments show over time, could collapse the entire deception. Yet between the 15th of April and the 5th of June 1944, German intelligence catalogued Fuseg as a confirmed threat, allocating 19 divisions to defend paddle forces that would not reach Normandy for critical weeks after D-Day. Post-war interrogation of Abbas Alexis Finroa, who headed Foreign Armies West, the Wehrmacht's Western intelligence branch, revealed that German intelligence never questioned Fuss's existence. Von Rona's 17th May 1944 assessment stated the concentration area southeast of London contains approximately 20 to 25 large formations. The main invasion is expected against the line Dunkirk de la Havre. What made this work wasn't any single element, but rather the integration of physical, electronic, and human deception into what intelligence officers call a complete intelligence picture. The dummy tanks formed the visible foundation. Genuine tank crews drove real Shermans through Kent villages, ensuring locals would report truthfully seeing American armor. Wireless operators transmitted thousands of messages simulating a Corps-sized headquarters. Double agents fed carefully crafted intelligence confirming Allied intentions toward Kalala. German reconnaissance photographed the dummy installations and reported what they saw, which matched precisely what agents told them, which matched the wireless traffic patterns they intercepted. Each element reinforced the others, creating a web of corroborating evidence too consistent to dismiss. The dummy tank deployment required extraordinary attention to detail. Colonel David Strangeways, commanding our force, the deception unit supporting 21st Army Group, insisted that dummy installations replicate every aspect of genuine deployments visible to aerial observation. Dummy tank parks included representative numbers of supply LRIs, real vehicles positioned for maximum photographic effect. Genuine anti-aircraft batteries protected the dummy installations because undefended tank concentrations would seem suspicious. Crews created realistic track patterns using specialized equipment, then maintained them by walking specific routes in boots fitted with tank track sole attachments. When new dummy tanks were deployed, they appeared gradually over 2 to 3 days, matching the pace of actual tank deliveries. When weather prevented Luftwaffe reconnaissance, crews sometimes refrained from updates, understanding that sudden overnight changes visible in the next clear weather flight would trigger suspicion. The installation near Dover, designated Quicksilver Wand within the Fortitude plan, comprised 250 dummy tanks arranged in dispersed harbors spanning an area of 4 square miles. Photo interpreters examining the layout would observe textbook tank deployment. Vehicles grouped in troops' clusters, 4 tanks, with appropriate spacing to minimize bomb damage, positioned beneath trees or nets for concealment with headquarters vehicles clustered near wireless aerials and supply dumps at tactically sound distances. Luftwaffe reconnaissance photographed this area 12 times between the 20th of April and the 4th of June. German intelligence reports noted the gradual buildup, the arrival of additional formations, the appearance of new wireless traffic, exactly as planners intended. Sergeant James Ralston of No. 5 Camouflage Company Royal Engineers described the work in his post-war memoir. We'd arrive at a field near Ashford at dawn, unload 30 collapsed dummies from the LRIs, and by noon you'd have a squadron of Shermans sitting there looking proper enough to fool anyone driving past on the road. The trick wasn't just putting them up, it was making them look lived in. We'd scatter empty petrol tins about, dig proper latrines at regulation distance, park a recovery vehicle nearby, string some washing on lines between trees. One fellow even scattered cigarette ends of American brands near the tanks. Seemed dafted at the time, but the officers insisted the Germans might photograph at low level. This attention to mundane detail reflected hard lessons from earlier, less successful deception operations. In North Africa, dummy tanks used in 1941 to 42 often failed because they appeared too clean, too perfectly positioned, lacking the accumulated debris and minor variations that characterize real military installations. A genuine tank leaks oil, creating stains. Crews park them slightly differently each time they return from maneuvers. Prolonged use creates worn pathways to latrines, creates bare earth where soldiers sit during breaks, accumulates the random clutter of soldiers' lives. The sophisticated 1944 dummies incorporated these lessons. They weren't just models of tanks. They were models of tank units, complete with the environmental evidence of hundreds of soldiers living and working in the area. The deception units also orchestrated carefully scripted security failures to make German espionage feel it was succeeding. British intelligence knew the Germans ran agents in England, and knew specifically which ones because most had been captured and turned into double agents. These controlled assets reported observing tank movements near counting vehicles on trains, overhearing soldiers in pubs mention units by designation. Each report corroborated the aerial photography. When reconnaissance photographed new dummy installations, within days, a double agent would report hearing local talk about Americans with tanks moving into the area. The synchronization was precise enough that German intelligence could cross-reference multiple independent sources and find perfect agreement, never realizing all sources ultimately trace back to British control. The conventional wisdom held that intelligence analysts trained to be suspicious would see through deception. German photo interpreters had years of experience identifying Allied equipment, knew British deception techniques, and approached their work with systematic rigor. They should have caught the inconsistencies, the too perfect presentations, the installations that appeared more by design than by military necessity. They didn't because the British understood a fundamental principle about intelligence analysis. Analysts operate within frameworks of expectation. When reconnaissance photographs showed tank formations where wireless intelligence suggested a major headquarters, where agent reports confirmed American units, where defensive dispositions made strategic sense for an invasion toward Kala, interpreters saw confirmation of what the broader intelligence picture predicted. They weren't fooled by the dummies alone. They were convinced by the totality of an intelligence environment carefully orchestrated to make the dummies seem like just one more piece of a coherent picture. This wasn't merely fooling German reconnaissance. It was exploiting how intelligence organizations function. The Wehrmacht's intelligence system suffered from compartmentalization. Photo interpreters analyzed images. Wireless intelligence decoded transmissions. Agent handlers evaluated human reports, and strategic analysts synthesized these sources. At no point did a single person with complete knowledge of all sources sit in a field in Kent, examining a dummy tank with suspicion. Instead, each element reinforced the others through an organizational structure that valued corroboration across independent sources. The British created exactly that corroboration, ensuring that every intelligence discipline the Germans consulted told them the same story. German defenders in Normandy experienced the consequences directly. When Allied forces landed on the 6th of June 1944, the German 15th Army, comprising 19 divisions, including several panzer divisions, remained positioned near Kalala, convinced that Normandy was a diversion and the main assault would still strike there. This positioning was directly influenced by intelligence assessments, citing the massive tank concentrations in southeastern England photographed by Luftwaffe reconnaissance. Not until late July, nearly 8 weeks after D-Day, did German High Command acknowledge that no second invasion would come. By then, Allied forces had broken out of the Normandy hedge, and the opportunity to concentrate overwhelming force against the beachhead had passed. Field Marshal Ger von Rund, Commander-in-Chief West, later told interrogators that the intelligence picture showing Patton's army group near Dover had decisive influence on German defensive planning. Wehrmacht staff officers had calculated that moving the 15th Army's panzer divisions to Normandy would require 3 to 4 days given Allied air superiority. Those divisions could have reached the battlefield by the 9th or 10th of June, when the Allied lodgment was most vulnerable. Instead, they remained near Kalala, defending against an invasion that existed only in timber, canvas, wireless transmissions, and carefully managed German certainty. The success of Operation Fortitude carried a darkly ironic postscript. After the war, Allied investigators discovered that Abbas von Rohn, the intelligence officer whose reports most strongly supported the Kala hypothesis, had been executed in October 1944 for alleged involvement in the 20th July plot against Hitler. His crime wasn't poor intelligence. Quite the opposite. Von Rona had been so convincing in his assessments of Allied strength, so certain in his analysis that Patton commanded massive forces near Dover that his reports contributed to Hitler's decision to keep the 15th Army in position, even as Normandy became obviously the main effort. The tragedy was that von Rona's analysis wasn't incompetent. It was rigorous, methodical, and based on every source available to German intelligence. The British hadn't simply tricked him. They'd constructed an alternative reality so complete, so consistent across every dimension of observable evidence that reaching any other conclusion would have required rejecting sound analytical practice. Von Rohn's mistake wasn't being fooled by dummy tanks. It was being fooled by a system that created perfect correlation between what German reconnaissance saw, what wireless intelligence heard, what agents reported, and what strategic logic suggested. He did exactly what a talented analyst should do: synthesize multiple sources, look for corroboration, and report his conclusions with appropriate certainty. The British had engineered an intelligence environment where doing one's job well meant reaching exactly the wrong conclusion. This reveals the deepest principle behind successful strategic deception. It doesn't work by tricking people into seeing what isn't there. It works by manipulating the context within which people evaluate what they see, making the false seem more plausible than the true. The dummy tanks weren't clever forgeries. They were adequate props within a comprehensive narrative that controlled how intelligence organizations interpreted every piece of information they collected. Britain's wooden tank army succeeded not because German intelligence was unsophisticated, but because it was sophisticated in predictable ways. The Wehrmacht had built an intelligence apparatus that gathered information from multiple sources, sought corroboration between them, and rewarded analysts who could synthesize diverse information into coherent assessments. The British exploited that very sophistication, feeding each source information that would corroborate the others, ensuring that rigorous analysis would reach precisely the conclusion they wanted. The dummy tanks themselves were almost trivial. 15 lb worth of timber and canvas erected in hours, lighter than a motorcycle. What made them powerful wasn't their construction, but their context, the comprehensive deception environment that made them read as real to every sensor and analytical method the Germans employed. They represented the transformation of deception from tactical camouflage to operational art, from hiding what exists to controlling what the enemy believes exists. In the end, those wooden tanks at Dover achieved what 40-ton Churchills could never have done from the same location. They held 19 German divisions in place for 8 crucial weeks, whilst real Allied tanks fought their way across Normandy. The dummy tanks never fired a shot, never moved under their own power, never intimidated a German soldier with genuine menace. Yet, their contribution to Allied victory was quite literally strategic. They weren't weapons of war. They were weapons made of belief, constructed to exploit the enemy's own intelligence systems. And for that singular purpose, canvas and timber proved more powerful than steel.